All right, up next on our agenda, we're starting a little bit late right now, but what we have is a special guest, Robert Lee. All right, he is a world-acclaimed cartoonist. All right, and he is up here to discuss industrial control system security for some reason. Just kidding. He is the CEO of Dragos, and I give the floor to you.
Thank you, sir. All right. So I get the privilege, thank you. I get the privilege of the post-lunch. They knew you were going to fall asleep anyways. They threw me in. This will be good. I was going to make an Alabama joke, but you already had Brian Singer, so all my thunder's taken as well. But I'm going to start off with two kind of almost outlandish topics, and we'll get into the material, but two important topics, I think, for our community. Number one, let's start off with a little exercise together post-lunch. I tell you, China is in your network. What are they there for? Intellectual property theft. I tell you, Iran's in your network. What do you think they're doing? Disruption, destruction. I tell you, Russia's in your network. What do you think they're doing? Electing people. No. No politics. All right, no. This is an industrial control community. You don't know, all right? You got to be careful. All right, so Russia's in your networks. What do we think potential activity looks like? Espionage. Maybe espionage. And then U.S. is in your networks. What do we think? Big brother spying. Usually you hear counterterrorism kind of discussions. Okay, so all of that is bias. By its very fundamental core, it's bias. We've seen campaigns, we've seen attacks be discussed by state actors broke in and stole intellectual property. So we fundamentally start looking at future activity with the lens of the past. And that's actually not a good thing in intelligence. Security analysts often get paid for their bias. I've seen something, I'm going to act the same way in the future, and I'm quick at it. Security analysts are responding faster based off of previous experience. Intelligence analysts get paid to diminish their bias, to think differently and try to think without that bias in the past. I would put forth to you topic number one, because I'm not going to cover it at all during the presentation, is attribution is fundamentally hurtful to you, not helpful. If I tell you China's in your networks, your incident responders and security analysts are going to start looking for things that they've seen in the past, which may have nothing to do with the case they have on right now. It's going to absolutely detract from what you're doing. And the problem I see in our community more than any is that we have this fetish of attribution as we deal with national infrastructure and governments and others get involved in a way that is very much hindering part of the discussion. So I'm not going to cover it at all today, but I will say, I've written enough and published enough on it if you're interested, but I'll note attribution is fundamentally harmful, not helpful to your security analyst. Strategic discussions and what your company wants to do with that information, that's different. But for the purpose of doing security, hurtful. The second big topic I'll start off with, and this is something we actually will touch on a little bit, is we're in a weird place right now in the industrial security community as it deals with insights into the threats. Fundamentally, we have a largely unknown threat landscape. If I look at IT or enterprise networks, and I want to know what's going on with the threat landscape, it's actually pretty good. The private sector has been fantastic over the years. FireEye, CrowdStrike, Symantec, Palo Alto Networks, name your vendor. They've helped really illuminate that threat landscape as it relates to the enterprise networks. Why and how? It comes down to collection and expertise. They've had things like endpoint protection systems and firewalls and intrusion detection systems that report back to the vendor when they see intrusions. They have incident response teams that go in and collect and get insight. They've got Virus Total, where people are just submitting a bunch of files. They have good collection, they have good expertise, which allows them to analyze and produce good intelligence. I would say that the private sector intelligence is actually even better than what the national government sees as it relates to cyber threats, just because they have access. That has historically never existed in industrial control networks. So we don't have the same collection, we haven't had the same expertise, so to believe that we can get to the same analysis and production to have the same dissemination of intelligence is folly. We simply don't have the insights that we would normally have in enterprise security. What that is lent to is an idea that the threats either don't exist or they're not as numerous. In reality, we're simply not looking. And as we increase collection and as we increase the analysis capability of the community, we are seeing more and more. So let's talk about what all this means. My goals for you in this 40-minute section, which is great, right? That's a very Dale Peterson thing to do. When you're done talking about threats and everything about the world of intelligence and everything else, and here's 40 minutes. Thanks, Dale. So I'll try. But it's actually a good prompt, and it removes a lot of the fluff, which is nice. So the first thing is just some of the history of ICS threats. So from an on-ramp perspective of I'm assuming that this isn't a topic that you're really intimate with, I just want you to walk out and being able to articulate some of the insights that we have learned off of things we have seen as a community. And I also want you to understand the value of that to the actual operations that we're doing at those companies. Like, why do we care is a really good question. In the world of intelligence, we have a concept called the self-licking ice cream cone, which is you just sit there and produce a bunch of intelligence and it benefits nobody. You just come up with cool research projects and, oh, didn't you know they did this one thing? Well, who cares? How can we use this? So it's this topic of you need to understand what asset owners and operators need out of those insights. And then lastly, again, just being able to communicate about it, I think, is a core. I'm a big stickler on lexicon and having the right terms that we use. Even when I say things like threats and vulnerabilities, that means different things to all of you. So we're going to define some of those things, at least in my school of thought. But right up front, the very first thing you need to know about any topic of cyber threats in the industrial sector is there is a ton of hype. Everybody cares about our infrastructure. It's something personal that happens around the world. You say, that's my bank, but you say, that's our utility. There's a personal thing that happens with everybody's infrastructure. We all care. We all care that our lights and water and fuel and manufacturing and everything stays working. So when people don't talk about what's actually happening and we're all concerned about risk, it forms this chasm where you don't actually have real insights and hype forms. Not out of malicious intent, but people care. So there's plenty of cases that I don't have all the time to get into. I've done these talks before. You can go look at them. But these are like 5 of the biggest 5, right? Alabama, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 of the biggest hyped out cases just in the last couple of years. The BTC pipeline. How many of you ever heard of the BTC pipeline explosion in Turkey? A couple of you, not that many. We're not participating after lunch. That's fine. That's fine. Not awkward. All right. 2008, a cyber attack from Russia caused an explosion on the BTC pipeline. That's the story. Bloomberg, national media, published it out. It's been referenced numerous times in congressional testimony around why regulation is needed for the gas pipeline industry. Turns out, completely not true. Didn't happen. Dug into the case details. Every aspect from an industrial control perspective were fundamentally flawed. Talked to the journalists, got their version of it. It was entirely crap. The water utility in Illinois. How many of you, I know Marty's like, I remember that. The water utility in Illinois, 2011, 1 year after everyone learned that SCADA was a term, right? Stuxnet, SCADA, oh my God, it's everywhere. SCADA's in elevators. Nope, not yet. So when we look at 2011, everyone's freaking out because a Russian IP address showed up in logs of a water utility 3 months after a water pump failed. Leaked to the media, went to the FBI, leaked to the media, and they said Russians are attacking a water utility. Oh my gosh, this is the recourse from Stuxnet. They got us, like the water utility in Illinois. Turns out it was just a contractor logging in and had nothing to do with the pump failure. And again, 3 months later, and the contractor was on vacation in St. Petersburg. Like these questions that need to be asked around what happened and what's physically possible, you'll see that theme. This is something I expected to have all y'all in this field as well, which is, can that even happen in our ICS? Is that something that you can do? How does it happen? Being able to push back on some of the hype. The Norse-Iran report, that was a doozy. 2014, Norse came out and said, Iran is preparing for a cyber offensive. There's 500,000 attacks on industrial control systems around the world by the Iranian government. Like, that's pretty intense. What do you define as an attack, and how do you define Iranian government? Turns out what they meant to say was, we stood up some honeypots and they got scanned by Iranian IP addresses. Little different. But it was used again in congressional testimony on why the nuclear negotiations with Iran should fail. 2015, Turkey blackout. There was a hottest day on record, transmission issues, caused a cascading failure. Maintenance actually was the root cause. But within the first hour of Turkey experiencing their blackout, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, like all your major headlines ran, cyber attack takes down Turkish power grid. They even had, it's likely an Iranian cyber attack, and they attribute it, where reference the Norse report, and they reference the BTC pipeline. They said, look at these other attacks happening. It's likely this is an Iran attack on the Turkish power grid. In the early days of attacks on infrastructure, nobody knows what's going on. Root cause analysis and incident response take time. The last thing we want is national level leaders freaking out because they're reading headlines going, wow, did Iran really attack us? That causes geopolitical tension. And our story, this is another topic I'll leave you with today, our story in the infrastructure community is being written with or without us. We can participate and tell the right story. If not, it's going to be told one way or another. And the last one, this one's just a personal favorite. It was 2015 after all this stuff came out. And they were having a cybersecurity conference in Tel Aviv. And the Israeli energy minister stood up and said, right now, probably not in that accent, right now, there is the largest cyber attack taking place in the history of Israel on our power grid. What he meant to say was somebody in a regulator firm not connected to the grid at all opened up a spear phishing email that had ransomware on it and locked out his computer. A little different. These things cause issues. And as we know and have learned in the past couple of years, it's hard to unroll those issues. There are people who legitimately believe the Massachusetts pipeline explosions were related to a cyber attack. The number of emails I get on, Rob, was that Traces 2? No, is ridiculous. We've got to roll that back. So let's think about let's think about one more case study, because this one was just fun for me. I actually got to work this. My background started out in the National Security Agency. The only reason I say that anymore is because it got leaked, thanks Snowden, so my name's up there anyways. And I built the U.S. government's threat discovery mission related to ICS. They were doing ICS security long before I got there. But on the threat discovery of what's going on and who's attacking our stuff, that was our mission. And I worked this case, and it was very odd because it was nothing. It was not important at all. And then in 2015, the administration leaked it to the Wall Street Journal, and they had this flavoring of Iranians broke into a dam in upstate New York, and they wanted to do damage and destruction, but they didn't. Here's the real story. The real story is some people from Iran, that's legit, accessed Shodan and saw a login on an HMI that was read-only to a dam that had a physical control system that you couldn't do anything to because it was a physical manual control system, and they accessed the web page. Probably not worth the spin-up that it got, but early days, people were freaking out. I remember seeing it, reporting over and going, hey, yeah, I see some activity against what's called Rye Creek Dam, Bowman Dam. Bowman Dam. Hey, DHS, take a look at this. Whatever you do, don't freak out. And I remember getting a call back as I'm sitting in my job, maybe like an hour and a half later, being like, hey, we need updates every 15 minutes. Like, what? Like, I told you it's not a big deal. No, we briefed the president. What? Like, there's a difference between, like, it's not a big deal and President Obama wants to know about this. And what it was is when they saw Bowman Dam, somebody who didn't understand ICS Googled Bowman Dam and saw the Arthur C. Clarke Bowman Dam, which is, bad if you were to hack it, primarily because it's like 7,000 people below it, but also because it's an earthen dam. And if you figured out how to hack dirt, like, that is pretty clever, I suppose. So, again, it's this concept of what's possible to balance out. We're never going to get all the details. Forensics in our community is not great. Root cause analysis is going to be a problem for people. Right now, we're leaning on the what's possible and what's not, and so we should keep that in mind. So let's talk about what we're supposed to do. First and foremost, what is a threat? How I use the term is not around vulnerabilities, and it's not around malware. I think one of the big challenges for a lot of people coming into ICS security from IT security is it's natural to view the world in the world of product security. If it's vulnerable, it's hackable, this is an issue. But product security isn't ICS security. It's more of a system of systems security than anything. So just because the PLC is vulnerable doesn't mean you can make the lights blink. So a threat is an opportunity and intent and capability. It's a human adversary and their ability to cause you damage. That doesn't mean that's where all risk relies. You can have risk from non-human adversaries. You can have risk from vulnerabilities. But from a threat, and the way that we're talking about it, I'm talking about the human behind the keyboard. And the reality of that is you're never really going against China, Russia, US. You're going against like a team of like 6 to 20 people. They're between the ages of 18 and 30. Government's their first job, and they also have PowerPoint and management. Like, you can do this, is my point. We are always in an option and always in a capability to do defense, but realize it's capability, intent, and opportunity. I'll give you a quick case study on this one. Did an incident response case at an auto manufacturer in Germany. Very descriptive. So an auto manufacturer in Germany called me up and said, incident response, you gotta push the button, gotta call. Go. Like, well, what's going on? Like, no, I'll tell you when I get here. I'm like, okay. Get there. They said, hey, Rob, Heartbleed's a thing. Like, yes, Heartbleed is a thing. Heartbleed was a vulnerability in OpenSSL that allowed you to read private keys off of servers. And they were very concerned because they knew there was people that had hostile intent towards them to steal the intellectual property as it related to self-driving cars that they were researching. And they said, we know that there's an adversary out there, hostile intent, check, and we know there's a capability, this Heartbleed. They spent a decent amount of money to go through the networks and realize they never had that version of OpenSSL anywhere in their environment. It was never an opportunity for it to be taken advantage of. They didn't actually have a threat at the time. It was useful to know, hey, vulnerability management team skipped this version. It's good insights, but they didn't need to freak out. So if we know what threats are, we need to analyze those threats, because one of the things I think also hurts our community is we typically think of attacks in a binary state. The attack happened or it didn't. And we even say things that are very ridiculous, like it's a novel attack. There's no such thing as a novel attack. What you're referring to is like one of the steps was novel to you. That's it. So years ago, Mike Asante and I wrote this paper titled The ICS Cyber Kill Chain. We extended out the Lockheed Martin kill chain and said, let's look at what it means to do the type of high confidence attacks that we care about in the ICS community. And this is a model we'll use throughout the rest of the slides to help us understand and evaluate these types of threats. So yeah, the typical stage 1 type stuff, none of that's really changed. I get it. All good stuff. The thing about the stage 1 that we care about is it the type of stage 1 activity that can lead to a stage 2 attack, or is it just random activity in like a utility network? Or said otherwise, did I see a phishing of credentials on the domain controller of a utility, or did I see them in the utility networks taking off schematics and engineering drawings? Different terms of risk level based on what the adversary activity might represent. Stage 2 is where it gets really interesting for us. Stage 2 is the adversary has to develop a capability or knowledge to be able to do something to that infrastructure. All of ICS security is kind of like IT plus physics, right? There's still that whole physical thing going on. So they can't just push a button and cause explosions. You have to actually understand what's going on in that environment. So they got to develop something. They've also got to test it. Any reasonable adversary that's developing a capability that's largely scary in nature to any of the victims isn't going to develop a multi-million-dollar program and go, all right, hope this works, click. You know, there's going to be some aspect of testing, which also introduces an interesting supply chain discussion of where your vendors are selling and who it's going to. Then there's a second mechanism of delivery. Now that I've got this knowledge that I'm going to do it myself, or this capability developed, I've got a delivery. I've got to install or modify the system and then execute the attack. And the attack might just be something that's supporting, like taking down a safety system, or it might be the actual attack, like opening up a breaker to de-energize electric systems. What I love about this, more than anything, it's great, yeah, to analyze that attacks and think through like we will, but what I love about this more than anything else in this community is this shows to me that we have some of the most defensible systems on the planet. There are simply more steps an adversary has to do to reach the kind of effects we're worried about most in our environments. There's more opportunities to detect, prevent, and respond than any normal systems. They're not necessarily defended systems. If you're not doing anything and you have the firewall rules set to any, like that's gonna suck. But they're defensible, and with the right care and feeding and the right people on top of it, you can move defensible to well defended. And that's something that's just a little bit optimistic, because I always got beat up on ICS security is 10 years behind IT security. Like we have a different mission. That doesn't even make sense. Our systems are highly defensible. So let's take a look. A couple case studies about threats you should be aware of. One, of course, was the Ukraine 2015 one. The behind the scenes on that one was always a little bit fun. I got to work it with actually Marty and Mike and Tim and a couple others. And I hated it for the Ukrainian people. What I loved about this attack is it really helped make it clear that there's various steps the adversary has to go through. The initial thing that everybody got spun up about was spear phishing emails back in the summer, about 6 months ahead of the attack, going out to utilities and people getting access. What I thought was interesting, though, is the adversaries that got access to the utility IT networks were there for maybe 3 days and then moved off of the malware. So everyone spun in the media, Black Energy 3 takes down the Ukrainian power grid. No, it didn't. The adversaries dropped Black Energy 3 into IT networks to get access, then moved away from the malware and started using more living on the land techniques. Legitimate accounts, legitimate credentials, VPN access, RDA sessions, etc. By the time that the attack had actually occurred, the forensics of it showed that the activity in the IT networks was just days. The learning in the ICS networks were upwards of 6 months before the attack. Not to say the adversary couldn't have gone sooner, but we still saw them learning up until the attack. There's that time component. Sometimes the best things we can inflict on our adversaries is the cost of time. It gives us opportunities to do defense. The attack itself, though, was interesting across a number of ways. One, there was around, three regions, 3 Oblin Ergos that had lost power. December, it's always in December. Never go on Christmas vacation. That's just the name of the ICS community. 3 Oblin Ergos, around 225,000 customers without power, 67-ish substations disconnected. But what was interesting is the response from the community. The electric provider started going back to manual operations and got the power restored, and that started happening around 6 hours. So there's part of the community that's like, that can't happen to us. And then there's another part that's like, that could totally happen, but it's just 6 hours of damage. We could totally deal with that. That's a hurricane. The problem, of course, is hurricanes don't choose where to strike and how to restrike. But the real impact is how they did the attack. Once they were in the ICS networks and they started learning the assets and doing asset identification just like defenders would, they found that there was serial to Ethernet converters, right? The thing that talks between the control center and the substation to convert Ethernet traffic down to serial communications. What they did is effectively develop specific firmware that was malicious for those devices, so that after they did the attack, which was nothing more than learning how to operate a distribution management, it was only just learning how to be an insider effectively. After they disconnected portions of the substations, they sent an update to the firmware devices that bricked all the devices, meaning that you could no longer have remote communications. Then they had malware deployed across all the systems, around 700 of them, that then deleted all of the systems. Then they had the UPS reconfigured that would drop all the systems to activate the deletion of the systems to then drop the power after all the attacks took place. And then just to top it all off, they had a remote denial of service against all their telephone systems so they couldn't call out in the field. So if you're an operator, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, getting ready to end the shift because it never starts in the morning shift. It's always getting ready for the night shift. And you're sitting there, your mouse starts moving. You're like, that's weird. And then you start seeing substations being disconnected. And you're like, oh crap, what do we do? Then power goes out. Then it gets restored by the UPS. But then the power outage itself causes malware to start deleting all your Windows systems. And then the UPS drops again and all the power goes out. And then all your telephones are denial of service. That sucks. But the real impact wasn't 6 hours. The real impact is they lost SCADA for 8 to 9 months. They didn't have automation anymore. And I see every now and then this discussion of, we should be able to go back to manual operations. That's nice. It's not really going to happen. Hope we're all aware of that. There's no media in here, right? Outside we can be yeah, we can go back to manual operations as long as we as a community understand it's not happening, that's fine. The workforce that knew how to do it's getting a little salt and pepper in the beard and leaving. The kids coming up with learning HMIs and iPads aren't the ones that are going to go in the switch yard and throw the switches, okay? And more importantly, it's a safety issue. Automation has helped us be a more safe industry. We don't want to have to operate in things like manual operations. Anyways, so when we look at this, what I like about this is if you look at the actual attack of using a distribution management system against itself to open up circuit breakers, that was novel at the time. Okay? But all the rest of the attack of I'm going to do lateral movement in the environment off VPNs, I'm going to abuse remote desktop sessions, I'm going to install malware across 700 HMI or 700 ICS Windows systems, all of that stuff is known tradecraft. It was detectable, completely detectable. So there's lots of lessons learned and we get new things, but it's not like this was some undiscoverable attack. Happened again. Ukraine has gone through some stuff the past couple of years. I don't know if you noticed, but in 2017, we learned about the 2016 attack. There are other lessons learned to be extracted here. One big lesson learned that I'll have around all threats and attacks is the first 72 hours worth of open source gathering of what's going on generally suck. Highly misleading. And in the world of ICS, which takes time to really get and do the forensics and get and do the analysis, it can take a month or more to really start having the real details start to come out. So there were presentations done on the Ukraine attack that were completely wrong. Entire presentations presented like, we are the incident responders. And they're like, look, there's macros and phishing emails and things that had nothing to do with the actual attack. And that was put out as gospel truth and fact to the community. And we just had no ability to push back. But in June of 2017, my firm and ESIT were able to actually get copies of the malware and look through it. And then later we actually got the forensic images and could go through and analyze what really all happened around it. We found what effectively happened was with access to the IT networks, the adversaries did exactly what we'd expect them to do from 2015. Likely the same adversaries. They found access points from the IT networks into the OT networks. This time it was through a historian. So they compromised an IT historian and moved inwards into the OT historian. And there they just used things like PowerShell and VBA scripts to move around the environments. They did living on the LAN techniques. In other words, legitimate accounts and credentials and things like that. Added themselves into the domain controller and Active Directory and all. That's very nice. And once they had learned that environment, they developed a capability that we call crash override and positioned it back in that environment. And all crash override did is no vulnerabilities, no exploits, nothing like that. It just took functionality out of the native protocols and used it against operations. IEC 104, 61850, OPC 101, just use the native protocols, which means you can't just patch it away. If somebody goes into your environment today, if you're an electric transmission provider, deploys crash override and activates it, if you use those protocols, it works. There's no patching that away. Again, why we need to be monitoring and do more in our environments, which Chris Sistrunk will get into next with the detection discussion. What was interesting to me about this attack, though, is it really looked like kind of a trial run. It was one substation, transmission level. The transmission level outage was 3 times the total power losses, though, of like the 67 in 2015, because transmission versus distribution in terms of size and scope. But what's more interesting is it had multiple modules, even modules they didn't use in this attack, which to us, to my team, looked at that and said, this looks like they're building more functionality in than needed, which might be indicative of future attacks. And so this is where we had to be careful. Another major topic when I said the threat is human. We look back to malware, we go, crash override. Here's what happened in the US community. It was a divide. Many utilities looked at this and said, we got to prepare for this. If something like that happened to us, those behaviors exhibited in our environments, what can we do? Let's do incident response planning and so forth. Half the industry or more looked at it and went, IEC 101, 104, 615, no, we use DMP3, we don't need to do anything. That was it. The ability to swap out a protocol is like less than 24 hours in terms of development by the adversary. So they missed the boat on the lesson. For us, though, as we saw the community kind of move past crash override, the adversary behind it, we track them as a team called Electrum, and they're still active. They're still in different infrastructure sites across Europe and still incident response cases and stuff going on. It's not a done deal. So this is another big topic for the community is don't be, I would say, dissuaded from doing security because the report got published. It's almost like we all pat each other on the back, like the report's out, we're good, we're finished, and then we're done. The problem, of course, is it's still the adversary, they're still ongoing. We still have to be careful of the fact that there's still active human threats. A lot of lessons, of course, to be learned from Ukraine 2016. The last one we'll get into is Trisis. Some of you will call it Triton. I'll give you another real quick tangential thing because I'm kind of an ADD person anyways. I'm like how all these attacks and things get named. So I think there's always confusion around that. And then as I hit the mic, there we go. I'm just gonna move it up. That'll be good. All right, so Trisis and Triton. Why did the two different names? FireEye worked the case, named it Triton. Dragos worked the case, named it Trisis. We didn't know each other working the case. That's all it came down to. Simple dumb luck that two companies working the case, nobody coordinated, and later on DHS came out and said it's called Hatman, which is not how you name things. So you can use Triton, you can use Trisis, but never Hatman. All right, so anyways, the big deal with Trisis is it targeted a safety system. So safety instrumented systems, the whole idea behind a safety instrumented system is the control equipment we put in place to protect human life. If you've got a digital relay and electric power, that's protection equipment. You're just protecting the circuit breakers. If you've got safety instrumented systems, you're protecting human life. And each one is specifically configured to that environment post a process hazard analysis. So it's unique to that environment. Even if the vendor is the same and the system's the same, it is unique to that environment. The adversaries, effectively with this Trisis malware, all they really did was use native protocols and communications to try to manipulate the logic to remove the safety logic from the system. And SIS can be insecure and be safe. Safety and security aren't always the same thing. If I can deny service to the SIS, as long as it fails appropriately and brings down the operations safely, it still did its job. Safety and security, not always the same. However, if I can manipulate the logic to remove the safety logic where it's still active and operating and operation stays up, but now I can do a follow-on attack that would actually kill people, that's obviously a problem. And that was what was taking place here. Again, we saw a lot of misconceptions. There was a foreign policy article that ran that said, Saudi Aramco is attacked by Iran. Both of those statements are wrong. Saudi Aramco is not the victim, and Iran actually wasn't the adversary, according to our knowledge on it today. So you got to be careful on, again, the early reporting. More importantly, though, we found that there was a team behind this. We, at my firm, we call them Xenotime. People just make up names to cluster various intrusions. They don't all map together because we're all doing our own unique things without insight to each other. But it's just an abstraction to note that there's a human adversary across multiple events. And Xenotime, we've seen them in this facility since 2014. So they were there 3 years before the attack, learning and profiling and experiencing that environment. We've also seen them in Europe. We've also seen them on a safety system here in the US. Like, they're an active team. So again, it's not about, oh, that happened there. It's, where else is this going on and would we be okay? As Chris Sisterunk talks about the detection response piece, keep in mind the value of intel, right? That goal number 2 that I had to the course, the value of intel is translating what it means to our business, not in that attack or that vulnerability, but that style of attack, that behavior that we've seen. How can we be good against that tradecraft and prepare for it, of course? All right, so what does it really look like across the industry? I would say if we look back towards the early 2000s and late 90s, it was ICS activity ongoing. It's not like everybody just got interested post-2010, but we weren't doing any collection. I remember talking to some of the folks at Mandiant who had done a fantastic job in enterprise security, especially back in the day, and the folks at McAfee as well, who had done a lot of the early like Operation Aurora and type stuff in that community, and asked them, hey, I know that there was a lot of infrastructure clients that were compromised in these campaigns. Did it affect the ICS? Did they take stuff out of the ICS? And in my interviews, it's exactly the same response every time of, oh, we saw activity go into that network stuff that you guys, what is that, in SCADA? And like, no, like whatever. We saw stuff, but we either didn't have permission, authorities, or skill sets to go do anything with it. So there's a lot of stuff that was going on, but there was a huge lack of collections. We just don't have the insights of a lot of the early attacks. Then we saw, of course, interest. We saw the Sandworm campaign that is targeting various aspects of Europe. Even in the US, we saw Black Energy 2 deployed. There are really only 5 ICS malware families: Stuxnet, Havex, Black Energy 2, Crash Override, and Trisis. But there's a lot more campaigns, a lot more activity, of course, that happens. Then around 2013 up until now, we've seen a massive explosion of insights into those threats. We saw the first ever cyber attack takedown of power grid. We saw the first ever attack on a safety system. We're tracking 10 different teams now. Before that was only like 1 to 2 at a time that we'd get. It's a ton of activity going on. And so here's a really interesting takeaway for you all on why intelligence matters and what we're doing. I would position to you that if you have standards, regulations, and best practices written pre-2013, you were probably copy and pasting a lot of IT security best practices that didn't break the ICS. Like, whatever this is that's best practice that doesn't break the ICS, let's move it over. But it wasn't necessarily addressing risk as it relates to our ICS threats. In the last couple of years, we've gained an immense amount of knowledge on how these attacks take place. I mean, a lot of the stuff's focused on vulnerabilities and patching and malware, when actually all the attacks are functionality abuse in terms of native communications. So we got to be careful on the lessons that we're learning and make sure that we adapt appropriately and make sure that our frameworks and regulations and standards allow that level of adaptability. So when we look at actually taking all of this stuff out in the world that is intel and consuming it, we had to be understanding that it's 2 different jobs. When teams like mine go out and generate intelligence, we take an intelligence requirement, We go have collection, analysis, production, dissemination, all that kind of intelligence lifecycle, and a lot of what we call intrusion analysis. You're looking at the various intrusions related to adversaries. But that's not what most defenders are doing. What most defenders do and need is intelligence consumption. You need somebody on your team who's smart on the business and the actual operations goals and can go out into the community to figure out what's available and translate that stuff back to you. It's fundamentally a different skill set too. It's more of a security operations or incident response type skill set than it is classic intelligence analysis. So my recommendations to you all, who I assume are mostly on the defender side versus the intelligence generation, is learning the business intimately is the most important thing you could do. A box of donuts and a case of beer go really far in the world of industrial operations. Like, go learn your folks. If your linemen are getting up at 3 a.m. to go look at the lines, go join them. Like, get out in the field so that when things happen, one of your big jobs is going to be downplaying the hype. You'll be amazed at how many friends you get in operations that'll later be useful for you. When instead of going to them and going, you have to do all these things because, oh my God, there's threats, you go to them and say, hey, that Washington Post article, no, don't worry about it. It's mostly hype, and here's how we know, and I learned that from you. And you build that credibility. And that way, when you turn to them in your community and go, this is real. This one's an impactful case. Here's what we need to do about it. You'll actually have the clout to go and do something with it. What I would also note is you've got to communicate in their language. I'm sure you've got inundated with this by the other presenters today around speaking industrial. We really got to have an almost sickening passion for those industrial operations. Like, if you can sit down in front of the TV show, like how it's made, and not get excited, you're just not going to do well in this field, I promise you. Like, it should be really, really fun to you. And so you should learn that language and how to translate it out. So there's some ways to do that, and some ways and abstractions to think about it. One of the abstractions is a paper I wrote titled The Sliding Scale of Cybersecurity. And basically, as I was dealing with military generals and NSA civilians and congressmen and asset owners and all these people, I'd go around and say, like, what do you do? And they'd be like, I do cybersecurity. I'm like, what does that mean? Like, I don't know. Like, it just said cyber and it was all better. And it translated down to effectively 5 categories and said there's architecture, just building it right from the first time, building security into it, patching it, logging, basics of architecture. There's passive defense, which is I'm deploying tools and technology that help give me visibility or defense against adversaries. There's active defense, which is I'm empowering humans to go hunt and respond and do things. That's the human component of it, moving from defensible to defended. There's intelligence about learning about my adversaries and all. Technically, you could do offense. It's a really bad idea. I'll give you something blunt to have after lunch, which is if you suck at defense, you're going to suck at offense, okay? Like, it's not a good idea. Like, I will hack them back. Like, that's not going to help. But technically, it's possible. And what I would note from intelligence, and what the thing that you should look to intelligence to do, is drive security down to the left as far as possible. The more that we take our insights and build better systems to start with, or build logging and visibility into them to start with, the better. It's going to help everybody. There was a point in my career where I had a security operations center in the U.S. government side of the house, and I had authorities for all of the Department of Defense networks for finding unique and new cyber threats. So about 10 million IP-connected devices. It's like, okay. First day on the job, I'm like, what's my network architecture look like? Where's my diagrams? And somewhere after they stopped laughing, we realized that we just had to go and figure that stuff out. Because if you look at 10 million IP-connected devices without any understanding what they are, it all looks like China. Like, they're everywhere. So we found that the advancement of all these 30 top-notch security operations professionals and whatever meant nothing on poor architecture. And so we had to start moving along that scale, if you will. And that doesn't mean go and do one thing and you're done. It doesn't mean just focus all on architecture. But understand the return on investment that you're getting by doing different actions. You should use intelligence to drive that change. I'll give you a provocative thought. Ransomware will not be an issue in 5 years. Microsoft is losing too much market share. The idea of ransomware is causing too much issues for their customers. Microsoft owns the physics of their operating system. Anything the adversary can or can't do in that environment, Microsoft owns it. Guarantee within 5 years, they take the functionality related to being able to do things like massively encrypt all your files on a system, they just do away with it. And they can. And we've seen that before. If you remember post-Snowden leaks, always a fun topic, post-Snowden leaks, we saw the NSA directors in front of Congress being like, we need backdoors and all. Why? Because it got harder. Security has been getting better over the years. I always hate those people, by the way. In politer company, I don't like using that word, but we're all in the industrial community. I really hate those people that sit around, defense is far behind, the adversaries have the upper hand. Like, I just don't want to deal with you as a person because you are just a negative person. The fact that adversaries have the upper hand is utterly ridiculous. We own our infrastructure, we understand it, we've got the ability to detect all along their stack. Have you ever heard this? Attackers only have to get one thing right, and we have to defend everything. Whoever said that is obviously never done security operations. That is so silly. The adversary has to get everything right and stay stealthy. We have to detect one thing and then pivot the investigation and win. Realize that you can drive those intelligence insights back along the stack. The way we hunt, the way we monitor, the way we do incident response, the way that we do patching. We published a report last year at my firm, Reed Whiteman published it out, showed that of all of the ICSsec vulnerabilities that were released in 2017, 64% of them were useless. Not like CVSS, whatever, like useless. Introduced no new functionality that was already not native on that system. It was stuff like, if I have this HMI and you click on this link, it'll give you access to the PLC. Like, I have access to the HMI. I already have access to the PLC. That vulnerability is stupid. So I'd position to you that intelligence is one of those things that can help you figure out like what 36% even matters, so I don't go waste resources when I have opportunities to do real security. So let's think about that in context of like Ukraine as an example. So if I just take, and here's my recommendation to you all, as we have a couple more slides and then we'll finish up. As you view attacks, especially in your community, you should start with the ones that are directly in your community, and then you should be tangential to the other ones in industrial writ large. Don't be like, well, that's power. Figure it out and learn it for your environment. I would take the sliding scale up to the architecture, passive defense, and active defense components, and I would take the ICS cyber kill chain, and for every observable step of the adversary, think of an architecture, a passive defense, and an active defense recommendation on that phase. Here we have architecture. Okay, for stage 2 delivery of Ukraine attack, moving crash override in. Okay, identify connections such as IT to OT historian and create choke points. There's a good architecture recommendation. Passive defense. Threat detection's in place for that type of lateral movement. I shouldn't wait for anomalies. If I know what it is, let me just write that detection. Active defense. Analysts should be familiar with historian communications to be able to analyze it out. So I've got 3 nice recommendations just off that one step of that attack. You should do that, and ideally, once a year, if not sooner, look at all the intrusions and things you deal with, and you're going to have hundreds of controls. Take the top 4. The 4 common ones across all those ones you're viewing, and there's your 4 things to do that are adapted to your threat landscape for your environments. Now you have meaningful controls that are translated to the business needs because it's stuff you're actually dealing with, rather than the top 20 critical controls or whatever else. Not saying that those things are bad, but if you can tailor it to yourself, you should. Trisis. How would you communicate with the business? Well, after Trisis, it would have been a great thing if you're on the security team to go around and say, hey, do we have an SIS? Not Triconics version. Don't get focused on the vendor, because that's just what the victim had. That's why that vendor was involved. It was, do we have an SIS? And if so, what do we know about it? If we needed to get data from it, if we have an incident response scenario and we're trying to figure out root cause analysis, if it's a maintenance issue or a cyber attack, do we have the ability to get that data? If not, what do we need to put in place? We had to figure out things like, hey, incident response. If we lose the SIS, are we even sending the incident responders in? Is that not like a safety issue in that environment? What's the protocol for how we do this, and what's the training for the incident responders that we need to take place in a non-safe environment, a hostile environment? Using intelligence to drive those questions is how we get better as a community. This past year, it's kind of funny, I was practitioner, and I'm leading my company, so now they're putting me in front of board meetings, which is a total mistake. I don't know why they do this. But I went in front of about a dozen boards at various energy and manufacturing companies this past year, and the questions are the same everywhere. Number 1 question, how do I know if we're investing too much or too little in industrial security? A board level topic. My answer, which maybe is basic, right? Comic book artist and writer, just keep that in check. But my answer is simple. If you're in the power industry and Russia throws everything they have at you and it's all completely novel, we'll forgive you. if they just do Ukraine 2015 and 2016 against you and you did nothing to prepare, like, you're liable. That's your fault. So my view is you should be taking the lessons learned of what actually happened in our community and making sure that you're good on detection, response, and prevention across those attacks. And if you're investing at least that much, good job. If you do more, fantastic. But if you're below that line, there's challenges, there's problems. So that's kind of what I said that leads into Chris's section, which is really, you should have a whole of kill chain type approach. Not, I've got this detection, or I've got a prevention, I've got a firewall, whatever. No, it's, can I get visibility, can I get prevention, detection, and response across the whole of those attacks? Trisis was novel in the execute attack phase. It wasn't novel in the engineering workstation manipulation process. It wasn't novel in the compromising of the vendor VPN to move it into that networks. It wasn't novel in the lateral tradecraft. It's detect one thing and pivot the investigation, and you can win. So what to expect in years to come? I fully expect that no matter how much convergence happens and we see technologies changes, the end of the story is our mission is different, our threats are different, so our people, process, and technology will have to be different to take on this ICS security challenge. So again, fall in love with those ICS operations. And then as I close it out, I'll leave you with 2 slides. One, there's various sources out there. Dale asked me to put up what they are. It's kind of hard though, because I'm like, Dragos, and here we are, Dragos, and it seems like a very light vendor pitch, but you can get Intel anywhere. Intel is just not universal, so be careful with that. What I would ask you to do is those considerations on the side. What are our requirements? What do we actually want out of this? You shouldn't go to Intel and say, impress me. You should go to Intel with requirements of, here's what I want to do in my operations. Can you help me or not? And then there's my contact information and a reading list for you. I'll leave up for a second while I transition. This is where you can get some good papers and insights into everything from the kill chain that we talked about to attacks that have happened out in the community. With that, I'll turn it over.
All right. Do we have any questions for Rob? Right up front. Rob, you want to... Robert, you want to take any questions?
Sure. That's okay. I can speak. Oh, you're recording. Okay. Yes. Questions. Who? Carter. Yes, sir. Oh, I guess you can have it if you want. That's fine.
Just so we can record that too. You mentioned that there isn't the same level of intelligence in ICS as there is in corporate IT. With Chris, Cass, your neighborhood keeper, all that stuff, do you think the trend is improving, or what do you think it is today versus tomorrow and yesterday?
Yeah, so I think it is improving vastly. I think the type of insights and people getting excited about ICS security is driving more monitoring in. To make that a little bit more crystal clear, as an example, I constantly see like co-ops and municipalities be like, we don't have cyber attacks. And they're like, are you looking in your networks? Like, well, no. And I'm like, well, then it's kind of like Schrodinger's ICS, isn't it? Like, you just don't know. So I think we're starting to peel back that onion a little bit, if you will. And I think, CRISP is more of like IT level for utilities. I think Neighbor Keeper being co-ops and municipalities in the ICS will help. But I think mostly what'll change it, and actually Chris and I were talking about this before, mostly what'll change it is education and training and culture shifts to where if you would have told me 5 years ago that ICS companies would be having board level discussions around operations security and talking about network monitoring and things like that, like that's a huge shift in 5 years. So I'm not worried about not peeling back the onion. I'm worried about the insights that come off of it. If we're not careful about things like hype, Congress and others can just spin out of control about what we're finding. Or people won't be prepared to actually use it and consume it. They'll care more that Iran was involved rather than, well, what are we doing in our instant response? So we will have to be mature around that.